Peter, would you join us on the stage? I've taken advantage of the finance minister's model to remove my tie at Kopaonik. I think we can all enjoy the nice weather, the fresh air, and discuss economics and finance and business in a more relaxed atmosphere. So again, welcome. I'm happy to be speaking again. I'm glad that those of you who are here for the previous presentation on the business registry got to see some of the work we're doing on the investment climate and governance initiative. This is the second year we're taking advantage of all of you being here in Kopaonik and the fine facilities offered by the Grand Hotel to put our transition report presentation together. And as usual, we're very happy to have our governor, who is represents the shareholder Serbia, the Finance Minister VUJOVIĆ, joining us today to talk about our transition report. It's a good time. The title of the transition report is perfectly timed to the title of this year's Kopaonik Summit, which is all about restarting growth. And here this morning we were talking about restarting growth in a post-austerity period. Our transition report is more focused on restarting growth in kind of in the middle income trap, as we call it, where countries are moving along fairly quickly and then start to see slightly slower growth as they move along in their reforms. And the Western Balkans as a whole falls into that middle income trap. And our goal at the EBRD and our goal working with our partners, the international partners and the national partners here, of course, is to help Serbia to re-kickstart and get to a higher growth level and a higher speed of convergence with the European Union and the European states. So we'll be presenting our transition report. We're going to have three speakers. Two are senior economists from the EBRD. Peter TABAK will open up, and he has, with his team, prepared the diagnostics, which became the basis of our country strategy. And as I said, our country strategy was published on the web today. I hope you saw we issued a little press release, but you can now look at the new 5-year country strategy of the EBRD. So Peter has worked with our banking teams, and together we put together the country strategy for Serbia, which was approved at our board of directors just last week and published today live on our website. And then Alexander PLEKHANOV, who is one of the authors of the transition report, working with the senior economists in the bank, will present the findings of the transition report. And then I think we'll give Minister VUJOVIĆ the opportunity to tell us whether we did a good job or not in our strategy and in our transition report. From the EBRD's point of view, we will start our new strategy, but looking backwards, 2017 was a very effective and I think very successful year. We reached almost 400 million euro of new business. That included mostly private sector business. It included a lot of key first time ever in Serbia. That was the first time we had financed large renewable energy, the first time we had given a loan in local currency. You may remember last year I was here talking about local currency initiative. We did disperse and use the money that we've raised on the local market, and our friends from the Securities Exchange are here, and thanks to them for their help in working on local currency and capital markets reform. And we're going to continue to work with the Belgrade Exchange on some good projects in 2018-19 to improve access to finance in Serbia. And then finally, another first, of course, was a loan to a public entity without a sovereign guarantee. And Mr. VUJOVIĆ, I'm sure, is happy when we can lend to state-owned companies without a sovereign guarantee, because that allows him to use Serbia's borrowing space effectively for other needs. So we will hope to do that more also in 2019. So all of 2018 and 19 and into the strategy, all of those things that we achieved in 2018 were due to the strong reforms that the country has been carrying out. We all have spoken about the strong macroeconomic reforms, but also the policy reforms. And therefore, as I said, we were very happy to have our investment climate and governance initiative, which allowed us to carry out reforms of the business registry, but also in the area of inspections reform and in competition reform and in procurement and in PPPs and in corporate governance. and we will be looking, as I said in the previous session, to expand on our investment climate and governance initiative going forward in 2019 and 18-19 and beyond. We have, before I forget, at the table in front of us, lots of free reading material. So at the end of the session, please come up. There are copies of the transition report. There's copies of our investment climate governance initiative report. There's copies of diagnostics that we've done on the Western Balkans, some of which Alexander and Peter will talk about in their presentations. So rather than me take more time, again, thank you all for coming. This is a real pleasure for me to introduce the transition report. Of course, it's most important that we have partners, banks, businesses, government, municipal partners who are here with us, and we hope to be working with you very effectively in 2018, 19, and beyond. So thanks for your interest in the EBRD and for joining us today. So Peter, I don't know if you want to sit or join me up here and work from here. There's a... So Peter, TABAK, yeah.
Can we have the presentation on the screen?
Hopefully it's digital Serbia, you said this morning, yes?
If not, we have some copies of it here. Okay, perfect. We just have to go back to the beginning. And so, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to present the Serbia diagnostics, which is basically, this is a new product of the EBRD, and this is a paper which is focusing very much on how the private sector can be made more competitive, and this is also a background paper for our newly adopted strategy. So this was also published just a few weeks ago. And also, if you look at the key findings, they are also very much in line with our later transition report, which is focusing on how to avoid the middle income trap. The diagnostics is focusing on very much how to improve Serbia's standing, especially through increasing the competitiveness of the private sector. And we see quite a lot of potential for further improvement in the private sector. Definitely one of the key issues which this private sector development should focus on is the corporate governance, both in large and medium-sized enterprises. And for the small and medium-sized enterprises, it's mostly the still relatively difficult business environment which should be in the focus. And on competitiveness, the key issue in the coming years will be increasing productivity. And I will talk about that later. So Serbia is still has to do quite a lot in private sector productivity. And we see these gaps, quite large gaps in our transition gap assessment in all 6 transition qualities, but especially the governance again, and the inclusive growth, which should be very much in the focus in this respect. And last but not least, it's not theoretically not directly related to private sector competitiveness, but in a country which has a very large sized state-related economy, state-owned enterprises, it's also very important to focus on improving the efficiency of state-owned enterprises, partly because it reduces fiscal risks, partly because state-owned enterprises are providing important inputs, services for the private sector, and last but not least, because some of the state-owned enterprises are also directly competing with the private sector. So the macro overview, I think you heard it quite a lot of times today already, so I don't want to repeat the impressive fiscal results, the strong FDI, or the very impressive export growth of Serbia. What I would rather like to focus on is the still weak and volatile growth, which is something which the country has to address in the coming years. So if you look at the chart, you can see that Serbia's average 10-year growth was significantly below the Western Balkan 5 countries, so the other Western Balkan countries. It was less than half of that average growth, and it was even lower than the more developed EU 11 countries. And also this growth was very volatile, so basically Serbia had quite frequently some recessionary experiences as well. So it is very important to improve the growth performance of the country. One of the factors behind, besides the already mentioned factors like the business environment or the state-owned enterprises, is definitely the investment level, which is the lowest among the Western Balkan countries, below 20%. So this definitely has to be addressed in order to improve the growth performance. So why should productivity be in the focus in the coming years? So if you look at the left-hand side slide, you can see that Serbia's value added per employee, so basically the productivity, is more or less in line with other Western Balkan countries, but it is significantly less than that of the Central European 4 countries, so Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland, not to mention the average of the EU 28. Of course, this is compensated in many industries by the low wages. So that's on the right-hand side. And Serbia can be quite competitive in several sectors like information and communication technologies or manufacturing. But in the long term, of course, Serbia should not compete with low wages, but rather with high-quality labor and also as a manufacturing hub which offers good quality services as well and higher value-added activities as well, and not just a low labor cost. So this is definitely one of the factors. The other factor is, of course, the population decline, which is expected in the coming years. So that also gives quite a lot of push towards higher productivity growth. So what we did in this diagnostic exercise, we looked at a large number of Serbian companies and looked at what are the factors which are affecting their productivity. And what we found is basically in this table is that inclusion, especially youth employment, also governance, but other so-called transition qualities are also affecting the productivity of Serbian enterprises. But definitely inclusion, so including more, employing more young, talented people, and also improving the governance of companies, but also the general governance. So it's not only the corporate governance, but also the public governance, which has to be improved further in order to raise productivity. And of course, integration into the main markets, so the European Union, but also with the neighboring countries, the Western Balkans, through a better quality infrastructure, or the green qualities, energy efficiency, or recycling of waste is also something which can improve the productivity. Not to mention the macroeconomic environment, which has improved quite a lot, including the non-performing loans, but they still play an important role in potentially improving further the productivity. And in the competitiveness part, so that's the last column, you can also see that competition on sectoral level. So we captured it with the so-called Hirschman-Herfindahl index. That's also something which can improve productivity. So increasing competition can be also quite important. I have a slide about the EBRD's new transition qualities, but I don't go into too much detail. If you are interested, you can look into this in more detail in the transition report, which we have on hand, and also you can find this slide printed out, so you can go into more detail on this. What I want to mention is that basically we have changed quite considerably our transition methodology, and I think that these new 6 transition qualities are a bit easier to understand than our previous methodology we used, and they seem to capture also quite well how the productivity, how they are affecting productivity in the Serbian economy. And we also do a regular assessment of where the EBRD countries are standing in the transition gaps. And if you look at the chart, you can see basically that Serbia has quite large gaps compared to the advanced countries which we use as benchmarks in all transition qualities, but especially in competitiveness, in governance, and resilience. But the other gaps are also quite significant. If we go into more detail, starting with the competitiveness, basically the competitiveness of Serbia, based on a large number of different factors, is very similar to other Western Balkan countries, which means that it is lagging behind the EU countries, including the new EU member states as well. Serbia has improved quite significantly in previous years, especially in the World Bank Doing Business ranking, which was due to a large number of reforms, including the electronic construction permitting. But if you are looking at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, then the ranking is not so good still. And of course, there are still quite a lot of issues remaining which can improve further competitiveness, mainly the business climate for small and medium-sized enterprises. Also, the large number of parafiscal charges which can either provide a large burden for fiscal burden for smaller enterprises, but also takes a lot of management time as well. And also the access to finance is still difficult and costly. The other important issue is privatization and restructuring of large state-owned enterprises, which I already mentioned that it can still create some fiscal risks for the future, but it also has an effect on private enterprises through other channels as well. The low investment, I already mentioned, and skills mismatches that we find in many of our surveys, that companies are complaining about this, which might be addressed later on, for example, by the dual training system later. Governance was raised several times already. In the public governance, what stands out in many of the assessments, including the European Union assessment, is the shortcomings in the property rights protection and government effectiveness, as well as the regulatory burden, but also on the subsidies and which are not transparent enough, or the secondary legislation which is often adopted by significant delay. And last but not least, the corporate governance is also an important issue, both at state-owned enterprises but also at the private enterprises, many of them which are still run as one man, with one man or woman at the management, and not having necessarily all the boards which can provide more sophisticated corporate management tool. The resilience has improved quite a lot, as I mentioned already, especially on the fiscal sustainability side, but still the economic growth is still volatile and low, and this is one of the main issues which has to be in the focus in the coming years. In the financial system also, the non-performing loans have been reduced significantly from over 20% just in 2015 now to 11%, especially due to much tighter regulations on provisioning. But the sale and purchase of non-performing loan portfolios, although also improving, it's still behind other regional countries. So a focus on developing further the markets is very important. In the energy sector, there is a high reliance on coal from open pit mines, which can both create environmental problems, but also it can create issues during natural catastrophes like floods or very cold weather, as has happened a few years ago and last year as well. And this makes Serbia also vulnerable to climate change shocks for the future. So these are also issues to be focused at. I mentioned inclusion, and this is a very important issue. Youth unemployment is still high, although it has reduced in previous years. But more importantly, the equal access to training and an improved access to training and improved coordination between training institutions and businesses should be very much in the focus in the coming years, because having unemployed young people is really a waste of important resources. So the faster they can be employed, the better the Serbian economy will do. And although unemployment is high, in many cities which attracted large foreign direct investors, for example, are now facing a lack of skilled people. So again, this is something which can be improved through employing young, educated people. Gender inequality, although it's usually better than in many other countries in the EBRD region, there is still significant difference in employment of men and women, and again, a lower employment of females is also something which is a waste of resources. So definitely this has to be improved in the future. And women still face some difficulties in entering the labor market, and being employed full-time or having more flexible working hours, which can help basically to cope with for example, with having children and other tasks as well. I mentioned the skills mismatches, so we find it in many of our surveys, and also the unemployment rate of higher education graduates is higher than in many other countries or in the EU average. And of course there are other vulnerable groups like older people or Roma people and the rural population.
Peter, I'm going to encourage you to go
Yes.
to the final slides a little faster.
Yes. So on the integration, I don't want to go much over it. You know very well that the trade openness of Serbia has improved quite a lot, but it's still well below that of Central and Eastern European peer countries. So there is a lot of potential here as well. Also increasing the value added in trade and attracting much more foreign direct investment, because that's also significantly lower than in Central and Eastern Europe. Both the transport and energy infrastructure, especially the connections with neighboring countries, has to be improved further in order to increase the trade connectivity. I mentioned already the green quality. So Serbia still has much higher energy and carbon intensity than many of the peer countries. The air quality is still not the best. And the renewables, there are lots of opportunities to improve the renewable energy generation in the future. And of course, the wastewater treatment is also something which has to be improved further, because it's really very low. Only 10–11% of the population is connected, as well as the potential for the recycling as well. So I would just go to the state-owned enterprises, because I think that's one of the key issues to be tackled in the future. Here you can see that basically Serbia has one of the highest share of assets of state-owned enterprises in the broader region. But unfortunately, these state-owned enterprises can still improve their efficiency significantly, because the return on assets on state-owned enterprises is one of the lowest in the region. So it's, as I mentioned, it's not just a potential burden on public finances, but it also means that potentially the services these very important utility companies are providing is not what is expected by the private sector participants. So it's very important that this efficiency is raised, and the international financial institutions, including EBRD, is providing a lot of help in this respect to the electricity company apps, for example, or the railways, and a lot of municipal companies which are also providing important inputs for the private enterprises. Corporate over-indebtedness is also significantly higher than, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe. It's not just about state-owned enterprises, but also private enterprises. And I already mentioned that competition policies can be improved further, especially the implementation of the enforcement of decisions in competition law and also in the state aid. So all in all, the important thing is that productivity has to be improved significantly, especially through inclusion, not just young people, but also other disadvantaged groups, and also improving through improving or reducing skills mismatches. And the governance, the general and also the corporate governance has to be improved further. And the private sector has significant potential to develop and increase its competitiveness if the business environment is enhanced, and the public sector, and if the public sector becomes more efficient and provides higher quality services for the private sector. Thank you very much, and we will be open to questions at the end.
Thanks, Peter. And just to put again in context, the diagnostics report that Peter was just presenting is available online. The diagnostics forms the basis for the starting point for the country strategy, which I talked about. And as you can see, the conclusions that came out of that, when you talk about competitiveness, improving integration, improving functioning of various, the resilience and the green economy, those are the things that you'll see in our country strategy as we present it, and those are the places where we think we can make an impact with the tools that the EBRD has at hand. So this is, I think, it's a base, and it allows us to focus ourselves on the areas that we think are most important for the country strategy, and we think that's well aligned with all of the EU IMF, and of course the government's reform strategy, which Minister VUJOVIĆ presented this morning. I'm going to turn to Alexander PLEKHANOV, who's going to focus now on the transition report, which is our seminal annual report of not specific to Serbia, but to the wider region that the EBRD works in. Alexander is one of the lead economists who's written this year's report. And as I said earlier, the report is focused on are we helping countries, how are we helping countries, and how are they avoiding and getting out of what we call the middle income trap.
It's a great pleasure to be back in Kopaonik to present our annual economic report. Please feel free to pick up a copy. I think, yes, we have a presentation loaded. You can even do it during the presentation if you get bored and you want to go and flip the pages and ask a good question at the end. I will try to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. The report is called Sustaining Growth, and what we're looking at is indeed, as Daniel said, middle income trap. And if I were to summarize it relative to the previous presentation, it's basically highlighting the fact that Serbia is not alone. It's a kind of diagnostic that applies with various tweaks and nuances to a lot of countries where we operate. And in particular, we felt for a number of years that the slowdown after the crisis in our region has been particularly protracted and difficult to address. In addition, our countries are somewhere around what we intuitively call middle income, and this is a difficult situation to be in. It's a little bit like midlife crisis, and I will talk about it a bit later. And there is a distinct challenge that is related to it, making growth greener, which is also related to middle income trap. So we had this impression that our region has not been doing great after the crisis, but then the world has not been doing great. You read about it in World Economic Outlook, in World Bank's publications, and so on. And then what we did is a simple exercise. We tried to compare performance of every country in each year to a weighted average of growth of many countries that are somewhat similar in terms of income per capita and population. And we computed this delta, which are the bars here. And basically, you can see that before the crisis, not only the region had a good time in general economically, but it also has outperformed similar economies by about 15%. And since the crisis, it has actually not only performed weakly, but also more poorly than comparable emerging markets and underperformed by about 9%. And actually, Serbia has a pattern which is very similar to the general pattern, except it is a little bit more pronounced than the general pattern. It looks a little bit better in per capita terms, just because of the adverse demographics and depopulation that we talked about, but ultimately that doesn't change the picture. And then we sort of looked at it in a more broad context. So there is some component of it, which is specific to our region, but there is some component that is generally difficult for middle-income economies. No one really knows what middle income is, but you can think about it as somewhere towards 1/3 to 2/3 of US income per capita. In PPP terms, Serbia would actually be not very far off, 1/3. And then we looked at the data, and actually you don't find in the data that there is a particular income level which is difficult to overcome. In general, you have a law, I'll find this chart in a moment, you have a simple law that growth diminishes over as countries grow richer. It's harder to grow fast. And it's a fairly sort of smooth trend. You can condition on various variables. It remains smooth. But what actually happens in a very sort of U-shaped is if you strip it of the contribution of capital, labor, natural resources, and you focus on total factor productivity, the efficiency with which different factors of production are combined. And there you find that at these middle incomes of about 1/3 to 2/3 of GDP per capita of US, actually productivity growth slows down a lot. It may become negative, then it picks up again. And so probably it's useful to think about middle income trap as not a place, but actually a process. In a way, the difficulty is to have one smooth transition from low income to middle income to high income, is because the economic model changes, and very few countries actually succeeded. Maybe Korea, Taipei, China, Israel, that's about it. There are a few others that have done well. But in general, it's very difficult to do it in one go. Why? Because if you go from low income to middle income, whichever industry you take, if you take, I don't know, textiles, it's about producing textiles ever more efficiently in an ever larger factory and delivering these economies of scale. In China, there are button towns. It's a town of, I think, 500,000 people, a small town by Chinese standards, which produces 50% of world production of buttons. Every second button is produced in that town. It's kind of the Soviet one-company town taken to extreme, and you become very efficient at it. But if you think about what the high-income countries do, well, they design, well, firstly, they set up these production chains that include Bangladesh, and secondly, they design, apparel. They are the Pradas and Gucci's of the world that then produce in Bangladesh, or actually Pradas produce in Mauritius. That's sort of that. And it's rather difficult to actually transition from having this workshop ever more efficient to actually designing fashion. And if you look at assembly of iPhones, it's the same. You are making chips ever more efficiently, whether it's in China or somewhere else, or the washing machines, but then you also design them in California and try to design these production chains. And it's kind of a transition that is difficult to see how one exactly leads to the other. You have to switch a little bit the economic model. If you have been doing things well and they worked for 20 years, it doesn't mean that they necessarily work for the next 20 years in development. And that is basically the main message of the report, and why it is so difficult sometimes at middle income levels. It's also difficult as far as the green economy is concerned, because as you industrialize, you become more polluting before you switch to knowledge-intensive services and this other model of production. So actually your emissions per unit of GDP peak at roughly that level, and if you see Serbia on that chart, is quite a bit higher than the trend line. So that problem applies, and actually if you land here and drive to Kopaonik, you kind of see some remnants of this problem in the air. And in general, the EBRD region still remains much more polluting than comparators, although huge progress has been made. That legacy of central planning and disregard for environment is very much there. And then I will probably focus on just a couple of stylized facts about what we see in the growth. One is that the switch in region's performance was not so much about the global economic crisis as about the end of sort of useful lifetime of the previous economic model. In general, a lot of countries in the region came to apply market reforms with fairly strong endowments of physical capital and human capital by the standards of emerging markets, but under central planning they were very inefficiently combined. There was actually a good reason for that, because the central planning models were not particularly stupid, but they had their limitations. So they were basically kind of Leontiev-Kantarovich models of linear programming with shadow pricing. It generally works, but shadow pricing would include environmental costs, ideally transportation costs, etc. The Soviet planners had this sort of social idea that a piece of sausage has to cost the same in Leningrad, in Vladivostok, in Moscow, in Chukotka, doesn't matter where. Now, if you want to solve this problem in those models and have the same price of a piece of sausage, you have to disregard transportation costs and environment, etc., because it doesn't get solved otherwise. So that's how it was. And these models were run with zero transportation costs, and of course you just move people and inputs in whatever way it pleases, and it's optimal, but actually it's not. It's because you coded model that way. And this legacy was addressed through a number of market reforms. You combine it more efficiently, but that potential runs out. And that was a huge contribution of total factor productivity, these gains in efficiency with which factors are combined. Actually, that growth of TFP was more impressive than in emerging Asia. But if you go 10 years later, after that has been basically kind of exhausted. You see that for a region in general, or Serbia, it looks very different from our generic comparator. The comparator is still growing total factor productivity, and our region doesn't. And in addition to that, investment relative to comparators has been weak in these years, so one doesn't get a boost from there. There are a few slides on Korea and growth episodes that I will skip. I just wanted to give a couple of other examples of our analysis. In chapter 2, we zoom in onto firms and firm productivity, because ultimately if you want to solve a problem of productivity, you have to start at the level of a firm, as Peter mentioned. Actually, one interesting stylized fact there is that we always say that small is beautiful and SMEs are beautiful, etc. But actually small, more often than not, is fairly ugly. You know, a typical SME is a small company that actually in the region is fairly stagnant. It has roughly same probability of growing or shrinking. This productivity probability is not very strongly linked to productivity. Actually, Mexico is the same. A lot of Latin American countries are the same. And what we also find is that the difference in, you know, there are a lot of things that are problematic with large enterprises in the region, as Peter has shown. But actually, if you look at the productivity of large enterprises here in the region and in Germany, of course, large enterprises here are a lot less productive. However, the difference between SMEs in our region and SMEs in Germany is even greater. Actually, that delta in productivity is worse for smaller firms. Why? Well, because we think the small firms, they don't grow. They don't have the right incentives to grow. A lot of it has to do with regulations, with firms wanting to remain under the radar, because if you grow and you have much more problems with them, taxation, labor regulation, informal economy, etc., then maybe you don't want to grow. And it's something that this region also shares with Latin America, but actually in emerging Asia it's different, and this kind of discontinuities to growth don't exist so much. There is more analysis there showing that actually it is very difficult to sort of drive this productivity convergence, but if you are integrated in global value chains, this productivity convergence actually remains until you reach 95% of US income per capita, and this is, I think, why it's great to see high levels of FDI here. I think that is very positive development. And the last anecdote that I want to tell you before giving the floor to the Minister and to yourselves to ask us questions is about how to go about green economy. Going about green economy is generally not very easy, but what we found in our report is that actually in a market economy, incentives provide a very strong impetus, and you just design the right incentives and the markets respond. You design the wrong incentives and the markets also respond. So this is the Business Environment and Enterprise Performance Survey and Enterprise Performance Survey in Middle East and North Africa. And what we looked at is the difference in pollution and energy use between well-managed firms and not so well-managed firms, depending on how much in terms of energy subsidy is provided in the economy. So we split it into quartiles here, and basically in the lowest quartile, the energy subsidies are 40 cents per unit of energy here, gigajoule, and in the worst quartile, it's actually $18 per unit of energy. And what you actually find is that in those countries where energy subsidies are high, a well-managed firm is about 40% more energy intensive and 40% more polluting than a badly managed firm, because, you know, smart managers, they just respond to incentives that the policymakers create. You subsidize energy, you subsidize pollution relative to labor, that's what you get. You get the opposite 40% flipped exactly the other way around. A firm that is one standard deviation, i.e. sort of halfway better managed in an economy which doesn't provide any energy subsidies is actually 40% more energy intensive, more energy efficient, and 40% less polluting. So yeah, it's actually, it's a very cynical result, but it just shows you that actually the power of macro policy and micro policy is a lot. And a lot of it is actually differences between, you know, Egypt and Jordans and so on. In general, these are not, you know, hugely well-managed firms. They're just, you know, differences between well-managed firms and not so well-managed firms. So I think that if we think about the middle-income trap, we have to think about new ways of sort of moving the economy towards the model that has more innovation and more entrepreneurship in it, something that was talked about a lot in the opening panel, which Andrew Page talked here a couple of panels ago, and many other people will talk during this forum, but it is very relevant. It's also about setting those micro incentives right. And it's also about, yes, revisiting your aspirations a little bit. That's the analogy with the midlife crisis. You kind of, you stop and you think what you want to do and where you want to get, and then things hopefully eventually become better from there. So on this semi-cheerful note, I will stop here, and I very much hope that we will have a Q&A session afterwards.
Thanks, Alexander. So two very different presentations, and they gave, I could tell the minister was jumping up to make comments as both Peter were talking and Alexander was talking. So I give him the opportunity to perhaps comment on the Serbian economy a little bit, but if also I hope the transition report presentation, which is the whole goal of this, gave you also some food for thought. In terms, and particularly, I think in the most important way, that there is an optimistic scenario as we continue to push for reforms and continue to move forward, that incentives work and people can get the economy moving faster than it's moving today. But I won't guess what you'll say next. Please, Minister VUJOVIĆ.
Thank you. Look, I'm very grateful for this introduction. I think we heard more than a semester value of assessments and analytical comments here, and it would be very hard for me to go and comment on individual things, but there are a couple of comments here that I would like to make. One is, first, I'm glad that the EBRD is upgrading the methodology and aligning methodology with the new developments. The old methodology, kind of most countries maxed out on the scores, so I think this one is a reload of the methodology that was going to produce helpful results for others in the years to come. Second, I think that there are many different attempts at evaluating this, so I think we are from putting emphasis on the right things, which is governance, which is productivity, which is efficiency, which is the green quality of sustainability from the environmental point of view. And each methodology has a kind of a different take at this. But I would not go into evaluating which one is better and which one is not, but rather that they are identifying similar areas of concern and similar priorities that we need to do. What is relevant for us is that we have to choose between these many competing diagnostics, and we know most of them. Let me start from the last one that you commented on, which is the green aspects of our development. It is not easy for a country at the level of development of Serbia, faced with the middle income trap, to address the environmental concerns that are wrapped in standards developed by countries that are now 5 or 6 times more developed than Serbia. Even those countries took 25, 30 years to gradually adopt those standards and then gradually implement infrastructure, energy efficiency, and all of these things. So here I think we see the tall order of reforms. It's easy to give you a sculpture of David, but it's not easy to adjust your eating and living habits to have a body like that, to have an economy like that. So in real life, what you have to do is actually make choices. Whenever you go to see a doctor, you know, he's going to tell you at the age of 65, you're most likely to have a list of 100 things that are wrong. And he's going to tell you if he's a good doctor, but we're going to focus on 3 or 4 that are really critical for the quality of your life and living 85 years. So after 85, you probably can die from any of these things anyway. So these are diseases that you're going to die with, not die from. So in this very, I think, impressive diagnostic, I think I would like to see that they overlap with many things that we try to identify as our critical concerns and our critical constraints in going forward. And these are the constraints in adding the political economy, adding the social aspects of the whole process, and what you are asked to do in a limited time frame with limited resources. So we can agree on any of these issues in isolation. I can fully agree, yes, this is what we have to do. And I would like to have a tax system of Sweden. I would like to have the European environmental standards, and I would like to have many other things. And we are trying to do that. But you are constantly caught halfway through, you know. So we are building the infrastructure. Let's start from this one. So after many years of doing nothing in infrastructure, we are now building a lot. And there's a long way to go before we finish. But we know as economists that the real results of this are going to come only when Corridor 10 and Corridor 11 are completed with connection roads, so that manufacturers in Middle Serbia can deliver their goods just in time to Hungary, to Austria, to Germany, wherever in Europe. Before that, it's going to be a lot of investment and very little return. So this is why I'd like to caution a colleague here that total factor productivity is a peculiar tool that will tell you, I look at my production function and I take away what is the dynamic of capital, of labor, of all the other factors that I can measure, and I assign everything else to total factor productivity. If I'm Switzerland and I happen to have a year with 0 capital, 0 investment, and 0 new employment, and I have a positive growth, all of it will be total factor productivity according to this methodology. And vice versa. We had a period of 2001, if I remember correctly, to 2008. We invested very little. And we had a huge GDP growth that was based on externally financed increases in aggregate demand, and therefore your total factor productivity is huge. You do not increase sufficiently your capital, you do not increase employment, your GDP goes up 5.9% on average. All of it is total factor productivity. Now, this sounds correct, but it's actually completely misleading. This is not something that is sustainable. This is not something that you can follow. Nobody is going to finance. If you have an uncle, and if we discover oil, then perhaps we could have this model of growth. Not in Serbia, not today, not anytime soon. Other important considerations. I'm glad that the EBRD methodology is now focusing on governance, the quality of governance, because this is one of the critical things. And I would add 3 components of governance. One is government itself. The second one is public sector governance. And the third one is the private sector governance. And I would like to see the results here, because my sense is that with some exceptions, that even the private sector has a long way to go, as we know from banks and companies and other things, that it's not the governance is not just establishing the board of directors. The governance is actually using these new tools to anticipate the risks, to allocate your resources where they should be, to have a lean employment structure that can deliver what it's supposed to deliver, and we are far from that. And then we go back and then you look at the public sector enterprises, and you see that a lot of things that are identified here as issues in the energy sector, in other public sector utilities, are actually failure of the public sector, public company governance system. And it's the governance system that is there on paper and is not there in reality. So when you put all of these things together, environmental considerations, you shouldn't be relying on open. I'm just putting sort of elements from different slides here. You shouldn't be relying on open coal mine pits. You should not have a high energy intensity. You should move to renewable sources and all of this. And you do it in Serbia that has 60% dependency on low quality, low calorie coal, that is done with hugely expensive equipment that cannot move, with a lot of labor that is sitting there and watching how these big monsters are grinding something that looks like earth to me, but it has actually some lignite in it. And then we say, but these guys say, let's build another one, and another one, and another one. There's a whole industry around saying if Serbia wants to grow, it needs more of these. And I say, maybe, but maybe we can save half of that. Save half of that and reduce the pollution and reduce the emissions of sulfur in the air by going into energy-saving things that could provide Serbia additional sources of energy for the next 10 years of above-average growth without actually polluting the environment and doing all those things. So then you see there are all those traps with the political economy and economic paradoxes here that are not simple that will stop you in the tracks. And the reason is that getting out of a corner solution is not just a question of analytics, but it's the question of timing, resources, what you can afford. Let me link this to what I was saying this morning. The real challenges in the coming decades are going to be how do you adapt to new technologies? And often, and Serbia and Montenegro are a good example of this, if you miss having fixed telephone lines 50 years ago, and you were lagging behind, there's no point in going back and building fixed telephone lines. You just move to mobiles. So you just move to new technology. You just need to know what you want to do, and you catch up. You do not follow what others did through the 18th and 19th and 20th century. You try to find the optimal path to where you want to go. Now, for this, you need something that is very counterintuitive. It is not part of this model, which is you need smart strategy and smart policy design. Smart design requires discretion. Discretion builds risks. So we would like to be in an area where analytical work will tell you if you do these assumptions right, then the private sector and the public sector will find their appropriate role, and they will interact. So the private sector will do investment where it's supposed to build investment. Public sector is going to do investment and crowd in the private sector, and all of this is going to be in beautiful harmony. This is not how it works. Because private sector, if you do not regulate properly, if you do not have the rule of law, is inclined to go and strip assets and do many bad things. Private sector can do as many bad things as the public sector if they're not in an appropriate, competitive, regulated, supervised, and law-enforced environment. So you have a difficult issue here. Then let me add, and what I'm saying here is that I would like to be able to draw policy conclusions from these presentations. They're fantastic. But to do that, I need to find resources to do it and time to do it. Time is of essence here. You know, there are things here, out of my presentation this morning, it turns out that what we need to do, we need to skew investment portfolio towards projects where the cost of adjustment to where the world is going to be the lowest. We have comparative advantage to train people to do it, and we'll be able to, with the limited resources, to catch up. In many of these things, solutions are present. My slides failed me this morning. IT sector in Serbia seems to have good potential, but it's minuscule, it's very small. Compared to the world, it's 10 times smaller. So how do you build a sector that is very promising, that requires trained, high level of skills? Not necessarily engineers or doctors of electro engineers, but what you need people who are capable to adopt and run with the new methodology, people who are on average able to program simple robots to do all those things. This is what this technology will be all about. Running 3D printers does not require that every employee is an engineer, but that they have literacy that will allow them to adapt new methodology. If Chinese can do it without knowing English, they write manuals in English without knowing English, then we can do it, I guess, using those technologies. Now the big question comes, how can you, and this is my point here, using this tool, how can you attract investment that will do exactly that in Serbia? We know the success stories from the early years of transition. Czech Republic, Hungary, were able to present themselves as the good destination for foreign investment. So and I'm not saying only those countries, but I know these cases. So they were able to present a convincing case for the big companies that wanted to have a hub in Europe to go there. And then Slovakia came on board. They were slow at the beginning, but then they came on board, and they became the hub of the automobile industry and similar industries. Now for Serbia, we're doing so many studies, and we are getting some momentum in attracting some industries. Dejan Šoškić here once wrote here, we're talking about big things, but we cannot make a hairdryer or simple things like a toaster. So the issue is no longer that. The issue is that we actually went beyond that. We are now going back to textiles and shoes and simple stuff that we are trying to steal jobs from countries. So we are going across the middle income trap in the opposite direction to steal these jobs. And I'm saying this is fine, but we should be aware of the fact that we have to go through the middle income trap. There's going to be others who would want to do the Georg shoes and all of those things. So we need to keep on running. We need to keep deepening the value chain and stay ahead of the game here. And I think this report is very good. So let me go back to the framework that our colleagues from the World Bank had presented here. They had a study called Manufacturing-Led Development in the New Environment. And they're saying, and this is repackaging the same methodology along different lines. They're saying you have to stay competitive. They're saying you have to build your capabilities. Because staying competitive, you know, and this is important, I said this morning, let me repeat this. Being competitive means that you spread the effort of doing this across all levels. Management, the policy environment of the country, and workers. Right now, we are putting undue pressure on the workers to work for 200 euros in order to compensate for all those things that others are not doing. So worker has to work for 200 euros to account for having to wait 1 day to get a paper from the local government, to wait for the water and electricity hookups and all of this. This all goes down to you have to be extra competitive at 200 euros in order to compensate for the failures of the system. In Switzerland, all of this is organized. So people there they took us to a glass Trüsche factory 50 kilometers from Bern. They employ 80% of the people from within 50 kilometers. And they're no better than people that you will find in Serbia. They were trained in this vocational training locally. 20% they recruit worldwide at top-notch universities. 80% of the people are local. What is their comparative advantage? They all use their houses to live in. So they save 4,000 Swiss francs on their apartment. If the same factory was in Zurich, they'll be paying 4,000 Swiss francs per month just for living. In London, this is what people pay. They pay exorbitant amounts of money just for the apartment. Here, they had free apartments, so they become competitive. They stay competitive at 6,000, at 10,000 Swiss francs. Same thing in Serbia. Combining smart strategies with this can give us a way ahead. Now, what we have been doing over the last 20 years, not only 10 years, 20 years, almost 20 years, is actually not following these principles. I'm not saying that we made a mistake. All I'm saying is that we ought to be aware of what we're doing. We are reviving some industries, but some industries have to be revived not in the old mode, but in a completely new mode. So there's no point in trying to revive some companies that were established on outdated technologies in 1980s, but rather use those facilities in the elementary human capital that you have to start new things that stand a chance of competing in the world environment. Last but not least, Serbia is a very small economy. So I'm glad when I see here that some of the best indicators are on connectedness in the region, that Serbia is actually doing well in terms of trade and so forth. I think it can do even better because there were old training and other linkages that existed in this region which can make it more competitive overall. So instead of adding economic dimension to the political misunderstanding, I was so glad to see the Croatian Economic Association give reward to the Serbian one. I think economics should go in the opposite direction. I had a quick exchange with the Croatian Minister of Finance, Maric, and basically he congratulated me and I congratulated him for getting the upgrade because I think the world sees this as one region. So 2 countries getting an improved rating for them is a sign of the whole region moving in the right direction. We don't gain if they're going down, and they should actually gain if we are going up. So in both of these directions, I think that, and we have indications that integrated integrated stock exchange markets, integrated flow of information, management schools, and all these other things that require good professors and good skills are critical for the whole region. Thank you.
I don't know how he does that, because really that was, you got to the heart of our strategy in 1 second and got to the heart of some of the issues of the transition report, and I think that was all off the cuff, so thank you. Actually, just a couple of comments. The comment you made about prioritizing 100%, obviously we agree, and it doesn't come through in just presenting the diagnostics the way Peter went through the whole transition qualities, because what we did in this strategy, as you know, is we tried to focus in on where we can be most useful, and that's the areas where both you would like to see us working, where the private sector would like to see us working, but more importantly also where we can be helpful, where we have skills to bring to bear. So we will continue to try to work with you on that prioritization and that of the strategy, and not just be scattershot. And of course that means working with our partners from international organizations. I like what you said quite a lot about the Western Balkan region. Of course that comes through in our strategy, and I agree with you 100%, and that's why we had this Western Balkans Berlin process and the EBRD summit just last week. And we talked about it, one of the panels earlier today was talking about that, and my colleague Charlotte Roux was speaking about the summit. So I'm glad we were able to present that as well. And of course integrated, we do work with you and with our IFI partners to make the economy more and more integrated. I definitely think we need to make leaps and jumps in the areas where old technology can be replaced by new technology, and that does mean helping small businesses, even though, Alexander, you frightened me about small businesses maybe not being as beautiful as I thought they were, but
they're beautiful when they grow.
I was going to say when they get built into value chains, when they play a part in the international community, and we're trying to work with our larger partners to help them link up with some of the smaller companies here in Serbia, so that, as you said, value chains are about getting access to roads, they're about getting access to markets, they're about getting access to technology, they're about getting access to the growth that some of these big investments that you're bringing into the economy can bring. I don't know what the time frame is in the next meeting. I get a Dan, you've killed all the time from the organizers. It wasn't me though, but we had 3 very interesting speakers. I think I'm sure Peter and Alexander are here for the rest of today and tomorrow, and if you'd like to grab them, please feel free. You know, Mr. VUJOVIĆ is always willing to get into a good argument at any time, so please grab him, and I'm willing to talk to you about what the EBRD is doing or any other topics, either in the hallways or over dinner or breakfast. So thank you for joining us. Sorry we didn't have time for questions, but please send them to us if you would like to, and thanks for joining us.